Dan is here to my left. He's the global sales manager for Comodule, and formerly a mountain bike racer and mechanic. That's pretty cool. That's cool. All right. And then Puneeth Meruva, who's a partner at Trucks VC and the author of Flywheel, which is a radar for the owned and used micromobility market and comes in the form of a weekly newsletter, plus many other things online. And then we've got Noah Stern, who's the operations manager for Third Rail Ebikes, one of San Francisco's largest e-bike shops and repair centers. I was also thinking about things that I wanted to talk about in this panel, and I have organized them into 4 buckets. So one is about shared versus owned. I want to talk about direct-to-consumer versus retail models for owned. I want to talk about why VanMoof failed. And let's end by talking about the infrastructure of service and maintenance. So again, on this panel, we're really beginning to examine the vital role of retail and service infrastructure and talk about maintaining vehicles and supporting riders. And let's just start with this first topic of shared versus owned. We've seen a transition, right? Like the numbers are showing us there's a transition between shared micromobility and owned micromobility. We're having more people who are actually owning their vehicles versus using them or operating them in different cities. And I want to get from your perspective what you think are the key characteristics of service and maintenance for micromobility. And Daniel, I actually want you to talk to me first about shared micromobility. Like, what are just the main things for service and maintenance for shared micromobility right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I come from a bit of a unique position in the fact that Comodule operates very heavily in both the shared and the end consumer ecosystems. When it comes to the sharing world, we've all kind of seen it all play out in front of our eyes these last 6 to 8 months or even a couple of years. But one of the interesting things we've been able to see is as the sharing industry kind of comes into maturity here, or a more mature phase, we're able to learn things from what worked and what didn't. And in a business that's so predicated on unit economics, we've been able to tell that those who were able to streamline and manage their serviceability are the ones who inevitably are still successful.
Interesting.
And so the ones that maybe didn't have their arms completely around how they were going to service things, when they were going to service things, and where they were going to service things, are the ones that seem to run into trouble earlier in the sharing space.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is an interesting point where you're basically saying that the consolidation of the shared micromobility industry that we're seeing right now is basically like exclusively due to repair and maintenance and whether a company had that dialed in or not.
Yeah, I don't think it's only because of it, but I think that is a really large factor that lent itself to the success of that industry. One other thing I would add is that I'm part of a larger organization, or Comodule is part of a larger organization that actually operates its own sharing fleet, only in the Baltic states, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But we were able to really learn a lot from both the people we were connecting at Comodule, but also our own fleet. And that is a metric, certainly, that our team focused on and has led to our success.
I was actually just going to ask you a follow-up question about that. So if you're a shared micromobility company starting now, like, are there a couple of things that you should consider that are those best practices?
Yeah.
Or is there even room for you in the market?
I do think there's room in the market.
Yeah.
Without going too much on a tangent, I think it's going to be more of a regional specific thing. And I think we're really going to have places where it works well and places where it doesn't work well. But from a service and maintenance standpoint, I think just focusing on the longevity of your vehicles is going to be the most important part. And then also predicting when those vehicles are going to need service and managing how those vehicles are serviced is going to be the other crucial part. Yeah.
Better hardware and AI.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So Puneeth, I want to hear from you about service and maintenance for owned micromobility. What are you seeing right now? What are some of the key components?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think one of the big differences between shared and owned is in the owned segment, the OEMs and manufacturers of the vehicles aren't as directly tied to maximizing their lifetime. And so a lot of brands, unless they're focused on being a premium brand with a great customer value, they don't really care about the vehicle once it exits their door. And so that's why you see a lot of bikes that are abandoned with a few hundred miles on them, a lot of bikes where people are disappointed because they have no real way of fixing them. And so you kind of have this bifurcation of brands that are like, premium, that have developed a reputation for a good customer relationship. and those that are just trying to push product. And, a lot of that really kind of starts to lean a little bit more towards the companies that have some sort of physical retail presence. So either selling bike shops, setting up your own stores. Those are really the only like valid and easy to use maintenance options for customers right now.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, this is also kind of not what I expected you to answer to this question in terms of like the bifurcation between brands and maybe on the lower end, folks who are just trying to push out the vehicles, make sure they get at least one, or many, they're going for a volume game. And then on the higher end, really trying to create brand loyalty by owning more of the service, the repair, and everything else. Did I characterize that right? Or
Yeah, I think that's correct.
interesting. Okay. So, Noah, I want to talk about what those two opinions look like on the ground. Like, what do you think? Is Daniel right? Is Puneeth right? Is there something else that's happening as operating third rail e-bikes?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of truth in what both the guests said. I work at Third Rail E-Bikes. We're a retail shop in San Francisco, as well as a brand that ships throughout the U.S. The customers who are coming into my bike shop are a lot of times coming from having the Lyft or the city bikes, the shared bike programs, and the first thing they say when they get on literally any other bike is like, wow, this is smooth, this is comfortable, this is lighter. People are very in tune with the feel of the bike. And when you come from a bike that's designed for durability and maintenance to something that's maybe up to the consumer to maintain, you get a very different offering. And specifically, I think there are a lot of direct-to-consumer companies that are actually doing a pretty good job at making sure that their bikes are being maintained properly. I mean, personally, I saw them outside Electric. I have a very good relationship with. Getting a hold of their mechanics, getting a hold of manuals, documentation has been really excellent. So as a retailer, that makes me much more willing to recommend their bikes or even push some of my clients to try out electric bike in general. Now, I've seen the complete opposite of that, where manuals and documentation from direct-to-consumer companies are very hard to come by, very sparse, and a lot of times the customers I see have been marketed to very effectively by Instagram ads, Google targeted ads, and they buy the bike, they're so happy, they see how shiny it is, the range, the battery range, it's awesome, and then they come into me 800, 900 miles later and go, I'm panicking, the brakes don't work, this doesn't work, I'm getting an error on the screen, what's going on? And it's because I believe that a lot of direct-to-consumer brands do not do a great job at explaining that when rubber meets the road, you're going to get a flat tire. That happens, of course. You're going to have to replace parts and componentry. And that seems to be an unattractive selling point in marketing, to say, we're going to sell you this bike and it will need service at some point. So I've tried to bridge that gap and make it as accessible and easy to understand for consumers who, some are the cycle, guys in spandex who have been riding since they were toddlers, and some are your average soccer mom who really just wants to get her kids on her cargo bike to school safely and effectively and is not worried about the latest Shimano derailleur and so on.
Yeah. It keeps me up at night, the latest Shimano derailleur. I almost forgot my question because that was pretty hilarious. So Noah, on this point though of D2C brands who are not including like manuals and not really educating their consumers around how to repair and service the bikes, do you feel responsibility then for those D2C brands, like to make sure that those bikes work well, because you're just trying to make any consumer a lifetime consumer of e-bikes?
Correct. Yeah, my motto is definitely to build a relationship for life. So when a customer comes in with a bike that we didn't sell them, we are actually one of the few bike shops that will work on that, whether it's an electrical problem or mechanical. We've definitely had to 86 some brands because they were so abhorrent to work with to get any sort of controllers or, display modules, controllers, wiring harnesses, that we've had to say, sorry, unfortunately, this brand we can't work on. But I do feel a strong responsibility for that. I encourage people to buy where they ride, to have a relationship with their local bike shop. because at the end of the day, a lot of our clients are people who are riding this every day, short spans, maybe 2 to 3 miles at a time, but they are using it for their daily mobility.
Yeah.
And when someone comes in and says, my, brake cable snapped, I go, oh my God, I would love to help you with this. Please, let's get to the bottom of why it snapped, what we can do. Let me check your maintenance records. And that is just not happening from any retail or any manufacturer. So as far as I know, there aren't many programs that automate. I mean, there are the programs set up, but there aren't many companies utilizing like automated emails that say, hey, you've had your bike for 6 months, get it tuned up.
Sure.
So list the bike shops in your area that will help you.
Yeah.
Yes, I do feel
Let's start now
responsibility
to do better. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add to that, a lot of the growing adoption of micromobility are people that haven't traditionally been bicyclists. So they don't know how to replace their own tire. They don't know how to replace their own brakes. They don't know that you need to go to a bike shop regularly. And so there's a lot of education that I think the direct-to-consumer brands need to do beyond just kind of putting these bikes in front of them.
Yeah. And we're not just talking about bikes, right? Like this is a micromobility conference. So Daniel, I know you all work with a number of form factors. How do you think, what Puneeth just says applies to those different form factors as well?
Yeah, so Comodule is, again, in the fortunate position where we do everything from motorcycles and small, we say anything that's a light electric vehicle, but to somebody who had never heard that term before, I say anything that's smaller than it. So yeah, we work across all these different form factors. And I think depending on how complex the vehicle is, you have to have much more integrated of a conversation, a much deeper conversation with the end consumer about how they're going to service, when they're going to service, and so forth. This is why the automotive industry has historically been much quicker to adopt preventative maintenance than probably the traditional bicycle industry and the scooter industry. But all of that still holds true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's just at different levels of complexity that you have to kind of address depending on the vehicle.
What part of the auto industry sort of nudging people to, go and get their oil checked or whatever is policy versus what part do you think is just best practice from the auto industry and wanting to, whatever it is, build brand loyalty, just make sure their products are in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think the example I used with someone earlier today actually was most of us have heard of Toyota and the reputation that Toyota had from the 90s and the early 2000s for reliability. If everybody who owned a Toyota was not getting their oil changed on time, Toyota would not have had that reputation, regardless of how strong the manufacturing practices were, regardless of how well designed the vehicles were. And I think that the automotive companies at a very early time period realized that that was crucial to the reputation of their brand long term. And so they did push it on the consumer. There's also interesting things about, cars typically have a very strong resale market and a mature resale market. So, oil changes on time played into that. But I really think that it was partly pushed by the automotive industry because it led to a more reputable brand.
Yeah. So we're puppets of Toyota.
I think one other thing to add there is selling a car is a pretty low margin business, and most of the money that they make is on parts and servicing. And so they're very incentivized to push people back to the dealers. And so I think there's a financial motive as well, in addition to policy and in addition to
that you don't see being the same with micromobility.
I mean, I think so. Generally, parts are a lot cheaper for bikes. I mean, the vehicle itself is cheaper, but I think, once you start to think about these bikes as more than a product that you kind of discard after 3 years, and you start to think about this long lifetime value, you start to think about their second or third life, that's when, these brands start to realize, well, pushing them here actually continues to let us make us more money.
Sure.
Those bikes the next time they're sold.
Yeah. What do you think is going to enable this second and third life of micromobility vehicles? Especially when you think, I'm going to come to you next, Noah, for your answer to this question, or maybe, Puneeth, if you don't have any thoughts, would be curious about Noah's thoughts on this. Like, is it basically being able to maintain the vehicles better? Is it that we should actually be embracing this Frankenstein approach where you're modding out your various micromobility vehicles, but just doing so in a safer way?
I mean, I think the big issue is there's not a lot of trust right now in the secondary market. Most of the information is self-reported. It's on places like Craigslist, which are, very easy to get spammed on or scammed on. So I think there's just not a lot of trust and you don't know what you're buying. And so unless you're buying a vehicle from, someone like a bike with a Bosch system, for example, where you can get that data, where you can get it easily repaired. There's a few kind of examples that there's some trust, but otherwise you're kind of, trying to buy a lottery ticket. And so it's hard to get customers to buy those bikes.
Interesting. I'm going to come back to you, Puneeth, in a second to talk about like data that we're collecting on, second life, third life of vehicles. But Noah, when you're doing repairs, are you collecting that sort of information? Like, are you,
Yeah, so when we do repairs, we have a point of sale system, Lightspeed, that we've integrated into our bike shop. They've done a really good job of just, customer management and keeping track of everyone's orders and repairs that we're doing with them. I think the secondhand bike market is especially difficult to crack that code because, one, I mean, again, this is the Bay Area. A lot of secondhand bikes are stolen, which is its own unique challenge. Two, nearly every warranty that a manufacturer could guarantee is void if you're not the original purchaser. So we've seen many bikes that appear to be brand new in great condition. Maybe the rider bought it in the pandemic and only rode it a few times, sold it. It has any electrical issue at all. And now that manufacturer is basically saying, sorry, this is going to be a $300 part, plus install and so on. So the industry itself, I've seen it be very top down, which is the manufacturers are kind of dictating all these rules and saying, well, it's maybe not directly going to add to our bottom line to make this more consumer friendly or easier to get parts from. So we're not going to focus on that in our business model, which that makes it very difficult for a bike shop to even do preventative maintenance. We offer a service at around 3,000 miles where we open up your motor hub and re-grease everything and check for, water damage, anything like that. It is very difficult. If we do find something, what do we then do? Bafang is somewhat able to give us some parts, and there are distributor networks for parts, but things like Bosch or Specialized, you really got to go through them and play by their rules.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, do you already, or could you envision a network of bike shops that are all sharing data, kind of across service and repairs?
Yeah, there are bike shop dealer networks that we participate in that have been very effective at sharing just like sales data and market trends. That's been very helpful for us. I am a strong believer that any amount of collaboration and honesty between companies is highly profitable. So I would love if there was some sort of central system or decentralized system, but for bike shops, bike retailers to interact with each other, to communicate parts needs, but also we need that interaction with the manufacturer, especially when we're dealing with brands across Europe and Asia.
Yeah. So, Dan, I'm going to ask you about a centralized system, right? Because you all have data from, presumably, you all have data from, all the vehicles that you're in, and also all the brands that you're working with. Like, what are you finding from the data?
Yeah, so we do have data on every brand that we work with. What we can do with that data is to some extent governed by data protection laws. So there are limits to what can be done. However, one of the things that we talk about a lot, and I think we can probably add to this, is eventually having some sort of a digital passport on your vehicle, or a Carfax is the example he used, that tells you what has happened over the life of that vehicle. It's, I think at this point, a matter more of people leveraging the data and using it. I mean, it exists. And I've seen the more successful brands in Europe are the ones that are using it and developing resale markets based off of it, developing best practices based on it. But the sad part is, at the manufacturer level, it's just a matter of people using what's already out there.
Sure. Yeah.
But a centralized system, I think, is going to emerge at some point. And whether or not that's a little bit fragmented, but has kind of a central core, maybe like one database, but then you have to kind of individually approach each brand. It could exist. And maybe 5 to 10 years from now, we'll see something that's like a little bit more condensed.
Interesting. I mean, Puneeth, you're our investor on the panel, so you're also sort of our fortune teller. Like decentralized, centralized databases. What do you think of the two approaches?
I mean, I think with any decentralized system, it's a matter of incentivizing people to use it, right? And if you look at the auto industry, which is kind of the best analog, we have kind of been forced into a centralized system because of vehicle registration. And I think it really depends on how we kind of start to think about ownership and title for micromobility, and whether that goes centralized or decentralized is, I think, what will ultimately predict where all these other things are centralized or centralized.
Interesting. So you don't have like a strong thought about whether it's going to be, bottom up or top down.
I mean, I think it has to kind of come from the manufacturers, because tracking ownership then allows you to extend or transfer a warranty. It allows you to kind of transfer all of this data. And so I believe it'll most likely be centralized.
Okay.
Most of the pitches we have seen are for decentralized, but that might have been more of a 2020 crypto boom.
Okay, I was going to ask, I was like, are we going into crypto, blockchain, or are we thinking more like a standards organization that's collecting all this information? It sounds like jury's still out. Yeah. I'm curious, we're seeing such market differentiation between direct-to-consumer sales channels and then more of a retail approach, which means that we're also seeing some tension between innovators who are trying to build maintenance-free bikes and then also innovators who are trying to make everyone a bike technician. So, Daniel, you're our mechanic on the well, actually, we're one of two mechanics on the panel. What am I talking about? And maybe Puneeth is a mechanic too. So we might have so Daniel, from your perspective, like which one of those two things do you think will win out? The maintenance-free bike, trying to train everybody to be a bike mechanic?
Yeah, so anytime you have a mechanical system, specifically that's transporting a human, there's going to be some level of maintenance that has to happen. I don't think we're at a point where we can create a vehicle that will last for 50,000 kilometers without any sort of maintenance. I think it's less a matter of whether it's a bulletproof vehicle versus who can work on it. And it's more a matter of getting your arms around the predictive maintenance so that you're ahead when something does happen. And that's something I really want to emphasize, is that if you can get people to do things like switch belt drives on time, service batteries or replace batteries when they need to be replaced, then you can rely on a mixture of both longevity and serviceability, but no matter what, your product is going to last long. When it comes to the two different systems, I think it's going to be a mixture. Somebody inevitably is going to have to service your product, regardless of how bulletproof it is again. But they need to be able to service it without too much investment and too many resources from your own company in order for them to continue buying your product, and also in order for you guys to be successful managing.
I mean, what you just said makes me think that with shared micromobility operators, it's almost easier, right, to do that preventative repair and maintenance.
Yeah, certainly. They definitely are setting the standard as far as how on top of their vehicles they are, and how well they're managing the data. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from that, certainly, because it was such a major part of who was successful and who wasn't successful.
Yeah. And Noah, you were mentioning earlier that you send out email reminders. What is your process for, trying to nudge people into repair and maintenance?
Yeah, I mean, so internally, we do have it set up where anyone who's been at our bike shop, specifically to our service center, and not come back within 5 months does get a reminder email that includes some of those pressure points. So like, hey, your brake pads might last around 800 miles in San Francisco. Consider coming back and having us take a look. It's free to have our mechanics look at your bike. If we're diagnosing specific problems, that's a whole other can of worms. But it's going to be very difficult to find that midpoint between having customers do it themselves and having manufacturing bike shops responsible for the maintenance. I deal with a lot of clients who do not want anything to do with getting their hands greasy. I completely understand. We live in a culture that, if you can press a button and get your groceries delivered, why can't you have that for your vehicle or your bicycle? So that has been a very interesting pain point. And I think that making it as the parts themselves as off the shelf and commonplace as possible will help everyone in the industry, from manufacturers to consumers. Having bikes with a lot of proprietary technology even if you claim it's very swappable or easy to come by, it's not going to be easy if a guy can't order it off Amazon at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
That's the space we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you've just served me up on a platter a question about Van Move. Yes? Okay, thank you for that coordination. Haha. Puneeth, let's go to you first. So what are your thoughts on how support, service, and maintenance might have caused Van Move to fail?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to preface by saying that vertical integration that VanMoof did, I am still a strong believer of. And I think that's one of the things that, is required to make kind of a visionary winner of the sector. They probably took the vertical integration a little bit too far. And so, for example, vertically integrating some of the controls and the service around it was great because when those services worked for VanMoof, they were magical and better than anything else. But vertically integrating things like handlebars, or for example, I have a VanMoof and I blew the tire recently, and most bike shops said they don't know where to get that tire.
Really?
That's an unnecessary level of integration, and it's not something that customers care or know about, right? Like that doesn't make a difference. And so I think it was a combination of that plus just growing pains of having so much volume so quickly, and they weren't able to have their maintenance infrastructure catch up as much as they wanted to. And you kind of see that they were starting to design for maintenance more and more towards the end. I think the S4 it was designed to be a simpler bike with fewer components and easier to repair, because I think they were starting to drown with some of those maintenance tasks. I mean, for me, I've had my fair share of maintenance problems with the VanMoof, but it wasn't a big deal because I lived close to a VanMoof store.
Right.
But I have, my partner Riley, he lives in Michigan, and he had problems with his VanMoof, and it's a nightmare. It's gone for 3 months at a time. You have to ship it. And I think, if you're going to do the vertical integration, just realize that it comes at a very, very high cost, and you need to be, honestly, the maintenance and that infrastructure needs to lead the way in front of the vehicle itself.
Yeah. Do you think the resale value of the current VanMoofs in the market is going to go up because they're going to be there's a scarcity, a vintage component of it? I know I'm taking up a little off topic, but I'm actually kind of curious your response.
The resale value of VanMoofs, at least according to the data I'm seeing on Flywheel, is really high. It has one of the lowest kind of degradation per mile of any of the other vehicles out there. Part of it is for a lot of people that think of e-bikes and they're not from the bicycle world, it's just a way cooler bike. It feels like an iPhone Tesla product. It's the same reason why Teslas are more popular or sexier than a Camry.
Yep.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So the other thing is VanMoofs are really, at least they used to be, I'm not sure what their systems are going to be moving forward, but they used to be great vehicles to buy used because you could contact VanMoof and get a Carfax report of the bike. It would tell you all the things that they did to it during maintenance. It'll give you a health report, status report. You could transfer ownership, which would then also transfer all your services and warranties. No other company was doing that. And so that made them great used bikes to buy.
Interesting. And it kind of ties back to the point around how it might be that the manufacturers are, kind of both owning the data, but responsible for pushing out the data. So yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I was going to add to what you had finished up with there. VanMoof has come, and I don't want to say they're gone. I think they're still going to be around. We'll see what the folks at McLaren can do with them. But what's really important to note about VanMoof is they did really impact the traditional industry in some major ways. And when it comes to the Carfax and the service report and all of this information on the vehicle, that was very noticed by the large OEMs. And whether or not we see it in a year or 3 years or 5 years, I still think that they changed the industry in a major way when it comes to that. So it's going to kind of move on past Van and live on future.
Interesting. And with the companies that you're working with as well, I'm assuming it's a mix of vertical integration versus, those who are buying component parts and pulling them together.
Yeah. And I think Puneeth really was correct there. And vertical integration makes sense in some ways, and it does not make sense in other ways.
Yeah.
The example I always use with VanMoof is the disc brake rotors. Nobody really recognizes if it's a SRAM disc brake rotor or a Shimano disc brake rotor or what it looks like. There's really no need to have your own independent disc brake rotor. And to my knowledge, there's no major benefits that come from building your own. But vertical integration does allow you to have significantly more control over the technology and the end user experience. And inevitably, as the vehicles get more complex, they are going to become more vertically integrated. So some of it was great, and some of it really did help drive innovation.
We need diagonal integration. Yeah, so something between, you know, kind of like a 75-degree angle. Yes. So Noah, from your perspective though, how did vertical integration, like, well, first of all, did you see Van Moofs in your shop after everything went down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. I mean, we were seeing Van Moofs in our shop before everything went down, and that was an interesting conversation to have with people that, yes, this is an e-bike. We are an e-bike shop. There's almost nothing we can do to your bicycle. I believe San Francisco had one major service center to service Van Moof bikes, which, from what I understand, the staff there was really good. And once you had an appointment and was getting your bike serviced, that was very pain-free. But when you're trying to scale a business and selling a lot of bicycles, having one choke point for people to try to fit into proved to be very, very challenging. And their shop was only about 5-6 blocks from us. So we would see a lot of people who would come in with a flat tire or just needing their brakes done, or even as simple as a kickstand, who would come into our shop, say, we can't get an appointment for 2 weeks. Can you help fix my kickstand? And we'd look at the kickstand and look at where those wonderful engineers had put the bolt for that kickstand and realize this was not easy and certainly not feasible for us to take on, as simple as replacing a kickstand would be on any other bicycle. We got a lot of people who would come in for test rides of anything on our lineup who had just come from Van Moof or were about to go to Van Moof and test ride their lineup. And quite honestly, as a salesman, I loved it. I mean, there was no greater boost to my sales pitch than having someone go to Van Moof. They're amazingly pretty bikes that just work until they don't. And most people coming into a bike shop already have experiences with other vehicles, with their cars, and understand that at some point it will need maintenance. And also with the price point Van Moof operates in, you know, you'd have a lot of people with second homes or people who take long weekend trips up north, and they'd say, if I get a flat tire and I don't have my toolkit with me, can I get this flat tire fixed in Napa? And I'd say, probably not.
Right.
But with 90% of other bikes, definitely. And that was the selling.
Yeah. So we'll move off Van Moof. I feel a little bit bad that we've now spent a long time talking about them. But and towards this question of, like, what is the infrastructure of service and maintenance? And is it something that you should own? Should you outsource it? Is it something that could be shared? And Puneeth, I'm interested in your thoughts here. Like, what is the infrastructure of shared maintenance? What is the infrastructure of service and maintenance? And do you think that's something that should be outsourced to folks like Noah, insourced? Like, is there some now hybrid that we're coming up with because of all the trends in micromobility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very dependent on the segment of the market that the brand's playing in, right? So if you want to be this very premium high-end vehicle like Van Moof, maybe it is to own that all yourself. And if you want a bike that's kind of, you know, more for the masses and can be maintained very easily, could be with bike shops or third-party networks. I think the important point is you need to think about it. And you can't just assume that it's going to be maintenance-free, because for a physical moving thing, that's just impossible.
Yeah. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I think I would echo all of his points there. I think there's going to be a mix of both. And I think what's really important to understand is that not just the US, but the world has a really robust infrastructure of local bike shops. And even if you're not making a bike, a lot of those bike shops can service a lot of your stuff, whether it's a scooter or even up to, you know, some of these smaller motorcycles that we're seeing. It really doesn't make sense to try and, not to use a really bad pun, but reinvent the wheel here. Trying to leverage as much of that existing infrastructure as possible is going to lower the risk and lower the capital needed to kind of get your business off the ground.
It does make it, because like micromobility has so many different form factors that the infrastructure of service and repair is across like many different, a motorcycle, you go to a different place than you go for a scooter, that you go to a different place for a bike. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's on the communication.
Okay.
First and foremost, I think not to make this too much about just e-bikes, but the bicycle infrastructure is very strong, and a lot of the mechanics that work at those bicycle shops can work on all of our vehicles and all the other vehicles that we're building. But if there's no good communication, then and these shops can't understand where to get a replacement part, where to get a controller, how to flip out a controller, then you're going to have problems.
Yeah.
But I would definitely encourage people not to write off the fact that, again, this infrastructure exists and mechanics are out there that can work on your product.
Noah, do you think you're going to become a micromobility repair shop, or?
That is a conversation we're having, because at the moment we do not repair scooters. How is only half the battle.
What does that mean? It's a mysterious answer.
Yeah. So scooters and e-bikes usually have different parts that require different tools. They are built from the ground up with different philosophies in mind. The placement of electronics is very different. The skills required may be similar in terms of wire soldering or, getting a wrench on there. But it's not one-to-one. And even there are a lot of scooter brands, because scooters are generally a little bit less expensive and are more found, I think, on like Amazon and Costco, for example, has a good lineup of scooters. We're seeing a lot of parts that can only be purchased from the manufacturers, usually in Asia. And just the shipping times alone to get those proprietary parts is very difficult for a bike shop to then come back to the customer and say, oh, yeah, we can help you on that. So in a month or two, I will have tracking, but I don't really get full tracking till it reaches U.S. Customs. So maybe in 3 months, we'll circle back if I can repair this specific issue.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really like
the popular response.
It's very unpopular.
Yeah.
And there needs to be more collaboration. At all stages.
It also seemed like there needs to be like an ed tech and mobility tech crossover, especially when it comes to the service and maintenance of vehicles. So final question for you all, and I'm going to start with Puneeth. Is there room for disruption in the service and maintenance sector? And what do you think will be the disruptor?
Yeah, I mean, I think the room is, like you were saying, really around communications and connectivity for these vehicles, and being able to keep track of the actual condition of those vehicles, whether, the actual service side of it, as we've discussed, there's a lot of different options and it's on the brand to decide what's what, but keeping track of what's going wrong is, I think, the big issue and the big opportunity. And I think a lot of connectivity companies like Comodule are the ones that are enabling that. One example, when I think of like great maintenance for these vehicles, is Skip scooters. They're obviously no longer in business, but they used to have essentially an expiration date on every single component of the scooter.
Wow.
And that's how they did a lot of the predictive maintenance and were able to get kind of industry-leading life on those vehicles. And I think those types of lessons of how shared companies use connectivity to maintain their bikes, there's a lot of crossover that should be applied to owned.
Daniel, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was going to say,
Shout out. Yeah.
not to turn this into too much of a sales pitch here, but I think, the disruption is really going to come again from people that are adequately leveraging all the data that's being collected. And for anybody who's out there, if you have questions on what you can do with the data, don't just see us, see anybody who's kind of doing connectivity and in the business of aggregating the data and processing the data that's coming from these vehicles. And typically they'll have a great explanation for where you can go with it and what you can do with it to make your business more profitable. But yeah, I think it all comes down to the data.
Noah?
I have a very fraught relationship with the word disruption.
Because you're from San Francisco.
From San Francisco.
Yeah.
I think when you have an industry that's predicated on rubber tires, a metal chain, metal frame, and that general concept of a bicycle has been really dialed in and supported for more than 100 years. Finding points of disruption, we'll rely on information and technology, but leveraging the existing systems and bike shop networks. I know I'm biased here, but there's simply too many gaps between the knowledge of the end consumer and bike shops, gaps in knowledge between bike mechanics and working on new electrical systems, especially as they get more proprietary. Personally, I would like to see that issue tackled first before going into I don't know, the crypto Web3 of.
Well, with that said, we're going to go ahead and give a huge round of applause to this panel.